Let's do it here, Ada, David whispered urgently, his voice trembling with excitement and nervousness. His hands were cold, but he gripped hers tightly, pulling her closer. His expression was a mix of curiosity, confusion, and a strange insistence. We'll be quick. No one is here. I promise. Ada's heart pounded in her chest. Her eyes widened in shock. David, no. This isn't right. It's wrong, very, very wrong. But David's face contorted with desperation. He didn't seem to hear her. Why not, Ada? People do it all the time. We saw them. They weren't scared. They smiled. It's not a big deal. Ada's tears started to flow, falling silently down her cheeks. Her small body shook with fear, the heaviness in her heart unbearable. David, please stop. It's hurting me. This isn't good, David. Please, stop. Her voice cracked as the words stumbled out, the pain and confusion evident in every syllable. But David, his mind clouded by the thoughts he couldn't control, tightened his grip on her arm. His voice quivered with a strange mixture of innocence and desire. If it's so bad, why do people do it? Why did we see Mommy and Daddy doing it? The words sliced through Ada like a knife. She didn't know how to answer. Her body trembled as she pulled herself away from him, running toward the door. Her heart pounded so loudly in her ears that it felt like it might burst. This isn't right, she whispered to herself over and over, reaching for the door handle. It's not supposed to be like this. Welcome to Once Upon Africa. Before we dive into today's heart-wrenching story, we urge you to like, share, and subscribe to Once Upon Africa. We create captivating stories that stir emotions, spark important conversations, and carry life-changing lessons. The night was long for Ada. She tossed and turned, her mind consumed by the haunting question that David had asked her earlier. If it's so bad, why do people do it? Why did we see Mommy and Daddy doing it? Her heart raced, and her chest felt tight as she lay in the darkness. The images from the videos played over and over in her mind. She turned her back to the wall, clutching her blanket to her chest, as though it could shield her from the overwhelming thoughts. What did it mean? Was she wrong for thinking it was wrong? Why did it feel so confusing? Meanwhile, in the room next door, David, consumed by the same curiosity, had quietly snuck back into their parents' room. His fingers were shaky as he grabbed the phone off the nightstand, then locked himself inside his own room. The pull of the videos was undeniable, each new one more alluring than the last. What had once seemed confusing and strange now felt oddly familiar. His eyes widened as the images played before him, images that both thrilled and terrified him. He could feel his body responding, his curiosity spiraling out of control. The next morning, Ada found David in his room again. His face was illuminated by the lights from the phone screen. His lips curled into a smirk when he noticed her standing in the doorway. David, you're watching it again. Ada cried, her voice laced with frustration and fear. Why won't you stop? David glanced at her nonchalantly, brushing past her. Why should I stop? You know you want to watch too, Ada. Don't act like you're better than me. Ada flinched, the sting of his words cutting through her. A part of her wanted to scream at him, to shake him awake. But the other part, the part she couldn't quite understand, felt a strange pull to the screen. She hesitated. She wanted to run, but her feet felt glued to the ground. David, she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. This isn't us. This is wrong. But David wasn't listening. His addiction had taken hold of him completely. In the weeks that followed, David and Ada's little routine became a dark, secret part of their lives. Every opportunity they had, when their parents weren't around or when they were busy, they snuck away, taking the phone and locking themselves in their rooms to binge-watch the forbidden content. At first, they whispered in hushed voices, careful to check the door every few minutes. But soon, the fear and guilt began to fade. What had once felt like a secret now became an addiction, something they couldn't stop. One evening, as they sat side by side, David leaned in close, his voice low and urgent. "Ada," he said, his eyes gleaming with a strange kind of determination. "We should try it. Just once. They do it in the videos, and it looks fun." Ada's heart skipped a beat. A cold chill ran down her spine. "No, David," she said, shaking her head vigorously. "We can't. It's bad. It's really bad." But David wasn't giving up. His eyes were wide, pleading. "If it's so bad, why did we see Mommy and Daddy doing it?" They weren't scared. They were smiling. Ada's lips quivered. Deep down, she knew this was wrong. But David's words gnawed at her, weakening her resolve. She didn't know what to do. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body remained rooted in place. I can't," she whispered, her voice breaking. "This isn't us. Please, David, stop." The addiction seeped into every part of their lives. It wasn't just at home anymore, it followed them everywhere. David couldn't focus at school, his mind consumed by the thought of the videos, of the things he wanted to try. He became distant, distracted, and withdrawn. One afternoon during lunch, he grabbed Ada's arm and pulled her aside. His voice was low, almost pleading. "Let's try it here. In the bathroom. No one will find us." Ada's eyes widened in horror. "David, are you crazy? We'll get caught." But David was insistent, dragging her toward the restroom. "No one will know. I just want to see what it feels like, Ada. Please." Ada's chest tightened, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. She knew this wasn't right, but the pull of curiosity made her hesitate. They reached the restroom door, and as they stepped inside, the sound of footsteps approaching froze them in their tracks. "David. Ada. What are you doing here?" Mrs. Aluko, their teacher, stood in the doorway, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. David's face turned pale, and he stammered, We just needed to wash our hands." Mrs. Aluko raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced. Her voice was firm. "Get back to your classrooms. Now." The walk back to their classrooms was excruciating. Ada couldn't look David in the eye. Her face burned with shame, and her heart felt as though it might break. She could feel Mrs. Aluko's gaze following them, heavy with suspicion. That evening, as the weight of their actions finally crushed Ada, she couldn't bear to keep the secret any longer. Her mother had noticed the growing tension between her and David and decided to confront her daughter. One quiet evening at dinner, Mrs. Okafor leaned closer, her expression soft but concerned. "Ada, is everything okay?" Her breath catching in her throat. The guilt washed over her like a tidal wave. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Mama, we've been doing something bad. Something really bad." Mrs. Okafor's heart sank. She took Ada's hand gently and coaxed the full story from her. As Ada spoke, her voice trembling with emotion, Mrs. Okafor's eyes filled with tears. How had she missed the signs? How had she allowed her children to be pulled into this world without noticing? Mrs. Okafor's resolve hardened. She couldn't let her children spiral further into this addiction. She took immediate action. She spoke with the school principal, urging them to organize a seminar on online safety for parents and students. Together, they created a plan to raise awareness about the dangers lurking online and how to protect children from them. At home, Mrs. Okafor set strict boundaries. Devices were monitored, screen time limited, and conversations about the danger of pornography and inappropriate content became a regular part of family life. She made sure to create a safe, open environment where Ada and David could speak freely about their struggles without fear of judgment. But even with these measures, the healing process was slow. David struggled to let go of the addiction that had taken hold of him, while Ada wrestled with guilt and confusion. Trust had been shattered, and it would take time to rebuild. One evening, when the family seemed to be finding their way back to normal, Ada was helping her mother in the kitchen. Mrs. Okafor's phone buzzed on the counter. Ada's curiosity got the best of her, and she picked it up. Her eyes widened in shock as she read the message, "We are not done with you. You pay for blocking us." Ada's hands trembled as she showed the message to her mother. "Mama, what does this mean?" Mrs. Okafor's face turned ashen. She didn't need to read the message again to understand. The danger wasn't over. The fight had only just begun. What dangers lie ahead for Ada and David? How will they confront the people behind the videos? Will they be able to protect their family from the dark forces pulling them into the abyss? In today's episode, we dive deeper into Ada and David's tumultuous journey, two children whose curiosity and confusion lead them down dangerous paths. Their innocence, once bright, is clouded by the darkness they unwittingly step into. If you miss part 1, we encourage you to watch it for the full context. This is more than just a story, it's a cautionary tale, one that every parent and guardian should heed. The story doesn't end here. Stay tuned for the next episode of Once Upon Africa, where we continue to explore the dangers of unmonitored internet exposure and how families can fight back. Subscribe now to ensure you don't miss the part 3 of this story, which would be the best part of it. Kindly subscribe to Once Upon Africa for more.